Welcome to everybody who's joined us for this, the first of our two webinars for this afternoon. My name is Heather Deacon, and I'm the Business Development Manager here at Starboard Maritime Intelligence. And for the first session, we will be covering vessel networks. And for that, I'd like to just introduce you briefly to Dr. Fernando Cagua, who is a machine learning scientist and specialist. He has been involved in developing the network analysis tool for use in the vessel networks, and he'll be going through most of the presentation. You can also see probably in the side window some other of our team members, and Joseph Corbett and Matt Brown will be leading the second webinar session that's in about 45 minutes. This is being recorded, just so that you know, but your identities are all kept confidential, which is why your cameras are all off. But do feel free to type any questions you have into the Q&A box, and we'll either answer those through the session at appropriate times or at the end when we have set aside some time for the Q&A. So on that note, I would like to hand over to Fernando just to make a start on the presentation.
Thank you, Heather. Hello, everyone. So in one way or another, most people in this room, well, in this virtual room, are working towards one common goal, which is to have safe, healthy, and secure oceans. And that means that we're trying to answer similar kind of questions, which is which vessels might pose a threat to that goal. But answering this question is quite a challenge because there are thousands and thousands of vessels in the ocean. So many of you are using tools like Starboard to help you address those challenges. And one of the ways Starboard helps is by making it easy to investigate a vessel's history. So Starboard combines multiple sources of data like vessel information, algorithms, and customer information to mark multiple events over a vessel's history. And these events include things like incursions into an area of interest, port visits, fishing behavior, loitering, AIS gaps, anomalous movements, which Joseph will be talking about later, tags, and particularly relevant for us today, vessel encounters. And one of the reasons encounters are interesting to us is that we learned that quite a few Starboard users were using them to infer relationships between vessels. And also those relationships can provide them, or can provide the analyst with useful information about the risk profile of a particular vessel. So let's have a quick look of how that might look like. So here in the screen, we're looking at the history of the track history of two vessels that are licensed to operate in the Western Central Pacific. One of them is a fishing vessel that is flagged to Taiwan, and the other is a tanker that is flagged to Panama. And we can see that the vessels have met multiple times, and therefore, most likely there exists a relationship between these two vessels. In this case, it's probably a commercial one. But if I knew that one of those vessels is particularly high risk, perhaps because past behavior or infractions and things like that, I would like to assess how strong is that relationship between these two vessels, because that will give me clues about whether I should be paying attention to that other vessel as well. But even with an intuitive tool like Starboard, that can be a tricky task and potentially take a significant amount of time, because this relationship might have been built over a long period of time and over vast distances. So in this case, for example, we're looking at a couple of months, but imagine this going further, it can be quite a challenge to disentangle. And if you zoom out into the bigger picture, it gets even trickier because our vessel of interest might have met many other vessels that we are not aware of. And on top of that, most likely you are not interested in just one vessel, but you have more than one that you care about, that you are aware of their high risk. So we started thinking, how can we disentangle these vessel relationships? And the solution we landed on, and what we want to talk to you about today, is that by framing this relationship as a social network, we were able to piece apart these patterns. We use networks because they have shown some success in previous research, but it also felt like a natural fit for this type of problem of relationships. And we started with a few dozen known bad actors, and we found direct and indirect relationships to over 5,000 vessels. So we were really mind blown by these connections going on we were not expecting. So now I'm going to tell you the story of how we got there, how we built that network. So it all starts with a list of vessels of interest. Typically, this will be vessels that are high risk in a context that is relevant to you. And for this, for today's purpose, this list, our vessels of interest are vessels that have been previously involved in illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. And we chose a problem for a few reasons. First, IUU fishing is a leading security and environmental threat. Second, it is a problem that is relevant to quite a few of our customers. And third, because there is a publicly available list of these bad actors. We use a list compiled by TrickMatch Tracking, which is a non-profit organization that maintains a global list of prosecuted vessels that is compiled from multiple fisheries management organizations around the world. So we had like basically two ingredients. It is relevant and there is data out there to do it. And so just for illustration, on the right, in the right side of yours, in the slides, you can see a small number of these IUU vessels as red dots. So what we did is we combed over a couple of years of encounter data and added to the network vessels that encountered these bad actors, these IUU fishing vessels. So each white dot here is one of these vessels, and the lines represent a link between these vessels. But we didn't stop there. We didn't only look at the neighbors of these IUU vessels. We went one step further and looked at the neighbors of those neighbors. And we did that because two vessels might be indirectly related if they repeatedly use the same reefers or refuel from the same tankers. And so we wanted to be able to capture these indirect relationships as well. And the second reason why we look at neighbors of neighbors is because it's not uncommon for vessels to turn off their AIS and just go dark when they want to hide an encounter, for example. And so looking at these indirect connections might help us get around that issue. Essentially, what we're doing is taking advantage of the yield by association principle. And so this is what it looks like when we include neighbors of neighbors as well. And this is when we got pretty mind blown. From roughly 30 IUU vessels that had encounter history over the last couple of years, we got to almost 5,000 vessels that had links to them. And again, this is just including the last couple of years of encounters. And you can see, even though this is just a subset of the network we actually use, there is a lot going on here. And so we started examining this network and we found quite a few interesting patterns. There were some super connected vessels with lots of encounters, usually tankers or cargo vessels. We found lots of unexpected encounters like fishing to fishing vessels. We found also different clusters of vessels that were tightly related to each other. And this is the stuff that it will be really hard to find by looking at encounters on the map. So we're really happy with it, but getting the network, like what you see here, is just really half of the work. We still need to make sense out of it. What we really want is given the structure and patterns we see in this network, we want to know which of these 5,000 vessels are the ones I should be focusing on. So that was the next step. In the same way as Google, for example, finds the most relevant websites based on their connections to other websites, we use this network to find the most relevant vessels based on their relationships to the vessels where our vessels of interest, or the IUU vessels in this case. And to do that, we had to start putting, let's say, numbers into the network. And I won't go too much into detail, but essentially we can quantify each of those links connecting to vessels, as well as the nodes that represent the vessels of interest, like the red dots in here. So specifically, we use the linked weight to quantify the strength or the importance, if you want, of each of these direct relationships. And there are multiple ways you could quantify this importance, but we chose to emulate the way that analysts were already seeing this. So we were able to distill it into two components. The first is the frequency of encounters, meaning that two vessels that encounter often are more strongly associated than two vessels that encounter only sporadically. And the second component is recency. So in other words, the relevance of an encounter decays over time. Imagine that you have two vessels entering your area of interest, and one of these vessels encountered a known bad actor a couple of days ago, but the other vessel encountered the same bad actor a couple of years ago. If you had to choose where to put your resources, you'd probably choose the one with the more recent encounter. So these were the principles that we used to assign weights to links. And just as we did with links, just as we did with links, we can also quantify optionally the relative importance of the vessels of interest that sit the network. For example, when we built it, we acknowledged that relationship with vessels that were previously listed might still be relevant, but maybe not as relevant as relationship with vessels that are currently listed. And so that's how we can start quantifying these relationships of the links and the nodes in the network. And once we have that, we can use a few network metrics to find the vessels that are more relevant to us. Google uses a version of a metric called PageRank, and we use a metric called closeness. I'll tell you a little bit what closeness means in this context. Essentially, we're taking each of these vessels in the network and measuring the distance to the bad actors, and just adding it together. This distance is really just the inverse of the weight of the link. So the stronger the link between two vessels, the shorter their network distance. And once we have measured closeness of vessels to IUU vessels in general, we can arrange them, like order them, and put them into a distribution like the one you see on the left. And once we have ranked those vessels, then we can just define a threshold that distinguishes linked vessels, which are like all these 5,000 vessels in the network from closely linked vessels. So now an analyst can focus on the tail of the distribution you say there. So basically those vessels with the strongest associations without having to come through years of vessel events. So not only we're saving lots of time because it takes the algorithm just a couple of minutes of computing time to sift through years of encounter history of thousands of vessels, but also an advantage of generating this list algorithmically is that it's always relevant because it's constantly kept up to date as new encounters occur and as the relevance of older encounters decay. So now this is really just the story. So this IUU and closely linked vessels is currently in beta testing with a few of our customers. And we're really thankful to them because developing these networks models without them would have been not possible. We're still gathering feedback about it, but so far what we've received has been great. For instance, the algorithm has highlighted vessels that were already in the radar of experienced analysts. There have also been some instances of vessels that have been previously detained doing IUU fishing, but for multiple reasons, problems in the prosecution, for example, they didn't make it to the official list. So we are highlighting these already interesting vessels, algorithmically. So we're really stoked about it. And you might be wondering, how does this work fit in a product like Starboard? So Heather will make a little demo of how this beta feature currently looks like in the product.
Thanks, Fernando. And just bear with me whilst I bring up my screen, and hopefully now you can all see Starboard, the user interface with Papua New Guinea off to the left and a high seas pocket here in the center with lots of vessel activity. I think most of you will be familiar with Starboard if you've either had a demo or are active users, but there may be some new features that you're going to see now. So at the moment I have the fishing analysis selected. We've got the last 2 days. I just happen to have the high seas pocket area selected, and we're showing all the vessels on the screen. And what you notice now is in the analysis box, we have all the vessels that are registered in the WCPFC highlighted, and also it lists all those that are not registered. And then here is the new feature which relates to the network analysis tool providing the vessel relationships. So if I click on this link, it'll bring up all the vessels on the screen that are in that network. And whilst it's just loading the data there, it then brings up the details for each of those vessels. Now, just to make it more clear, I'm going to hide all the other vessels so we can quickly see which vessels are either on the IUU watch list or are closely linked to it through the network analysis tool. So in the boxes here, you can see these tags. And if I select these, it's now going to show you why the vessel has been tagged. So in this case, this vessel is listed on that IUU list. And it's also had past encounters with 9 other closely linked vessels. And we can look into each of these. If I wanted to click on any of these, I can go and look at a vessel in particular. Or I can go back to my list. You'll notice here that we've got this vessel is in the WCPFC registry. And if I select this, it will take me to all the details of that record on that vessel. So this is just pulling that data from the registry. And so all the information that you would see in that registry is now available here. If I just look at some of these vessels to see again why they've been linked. Again, this is an IUU listed vessel. It's had past encounters with 1 other closely linked vessel. And let me just select 1 or 2 others, maybe further down the list. So one thing with the list is those that have the highest links to the list are at the top of the list. So the further down, the less tenuous the links. So this one is just closely linked to IUU listed vessels, and it has past encounters with 1 that is listed and past encounters with 8 that are closely linked. At any time, I can select or add these additional vessels to my selection, and I can then do things like download these details as lists or look at their tracks, or I can view them and the analysis result in my list here and download this. So I think those are the key points that I wanted to show people. And I'm just going to now stop sharing my screen and hand back to Fernando to finish off the presentation. And then we'll be ready for questions.
I appear to have trouble trying to share my screen. Do you mind sharing the last bit of the presentation?
Sure. Let me go back to that one. So you just have to, I'll just quick whiz through to where you got up to. There you go.
Thank you. So yeah, basically, thank you, Heather. Sorry, I don't know what's something going on with my Zoom, but if you were to remember just one thing about this presentation is this, that networks can help reveal hidden relationship and help you focus on the best. It's certainly not a new idea. There have been lots of network experiments and research being done, quite a few consultancies that use network and analysts that will do excellent intelligence report using networks. But what really set us apart is that we are operationalizing this research and integrate it into the product and hopefully enable to do their best work, to do analysts the best work. As I say, currently in beta testing, but we're hoping to release this to all our customers over. And we really see this just as the beginning of a bigger journey, similar to how we developed these network models for IUU phishing with some customers. We look forward to apply similar models, perhaps think about the possibilities of using your own information. Also, encounters are just one of the ways analysts build relationships between vessels, but ownership structure, masters moving from one vessel to another, port interactions, they're all part of the broader picture of vessel relationships. So now we want to open it for a bit of a discussion. We do want to answer the questions you have, but also, we want to hear from you how this kind of work could best help your work and your teams. Yeah, thank you very much.
So Fernando, I see we have a question that is, how can you see all the vessels with that tag? And so if I just jump back into this screen and go back to the analysis results. Oh, actually, I'm just going to go back a little bit more because before I added all those additional vessels. So where we've got the 30 vessels that were on the screen originally, I literally can then go to vessel list. And this has all of those vessels listed. And I can download this list. Or I can select them all and then start viewing their tracks. So hopefully that answers the first question. And another question, can you clarify if you are suggesting that the vessels shown on the screen are likely to be engaged in IUU activities? I'm not sure I fully understood that linkage. Fernando, maybe you could talk to that.
Do you mind repeating the question, please, Heather?
Can you clarify if you are suggesting that the vessels shown on the screen are likely to be engaged in IUU activities?
No, not necessarily. So what we are highlighting here is vessels. There are vessels that have close relationships with vessels that have been engaged in IUU phishing. Whereas that doesn't necessarily mean that because they have a close relationship, they are also involved in IUU phishing. That's not what we're saying. But what we're saying is that they are noteworthy and that perhaps for an analyst that sees those vessels, then maybe they can dig deeper into the history of the vessel, what they've done, maybe look closer into their logbooks and things like that to assess whether they have been doing IUU phishing or not. What we're really doing here is, instead of having to do a detailed investigation about every single vessel that comes to port, for example, if you're managing the port and the landings, you can maybe focus on those that perhaps are noteworthy or maybe have a higher risk because of their close relationship, but by no means that means that they are likely, but there is not, we are not judging the risk of the vessel, but just bringing it to your attention.
And the follow-on to that was in the high seas, we're showing the At Glory. So I've just selected that vessel and another. Are they supplying IUU? So I guess the relationship is illustrated. Sorry, I have to come back to that one. Is illustrated in the drop down to show you their relationships to the other vessels, but we can't for sure say what it is they're doing. So in the At Glory instance, it's got past encounters with 2 that were listed. So yes, maybe they are supplying them. And also past encounters with those that were previously listed. Another question is, how do we detect dark target that are not shown on the screen?
I can talk a little bit about that. So if a vessel goes dark and wants to hide an encounter, we really cannot see that. And so that doesn't go into the network. But because of the way we build it, which looks also at indirect relationships, we're able to overcome that obstacle a little bit. So for example, there are a few instances where a longliner will turn off their AIS and go and encounter another vessel, but we're still able to detect the encounter indirectly because perhaps they forgot to turn off a couple of their buoys. And so we notice there is a buoy of one vessel connected to another vessel. And then we can infer this indirect relationship because we know that buoy belongs to a particular vessel. So in essence, when a vessel goes dark, it's not part of the network, and that's a downside of it. But because of the way we do it, we still can see the signature of those encounters occasionally. Yeah.
Thanks. There's a few questions coming in now, so if you bear with me. I found some vessels on the other platform of tracking vessels, but the name of those vessels did not appear on Starboard. Can you help me with this? So I think this is where we sometimes have vessels that are listed as unknown. Fernando, would you have an answer for that?
No, I think that's it's perhaps separate issue to the networks. It's a problem with the AIS feed. So in Starboard, we take the data that is transmitted to AIS, and sometimes that doesn't match when they use different providers.
Okay, thank you. There's another question, I think, which is about dark vessels, also identified in the system, and how can we identify them and their activity? I think we've possibly broached that one already. In respect to the fact that all vessels displayed here are solely based on AIS data, and that AIS devices can be removed and placed on another vessel, how do we know when and if an AIS device is placed on another vessel?
Yeah, that's definitely a big challenge. It's currently really, really hard to tell when that's happened because we're tracking the AIS device rather than the vessel itself. So the options to do that is nothing, just manual investigation, right? You have to look back yourself where that vessel's been or the AIS device, and then you try to figure out if it's been something weird going on. There's been a few occasions where we have in the network, for example, a few vessels that have 2 AIS receivers, and luckily both are highlighted as closely linked, for example. We also had an instance where a vessel had one device and then it changed it. But because the relationships were so persistent over time, it didn't matter, and both versions of that vessel were still closely connected to other IUU vessels. So basically the lesson of the story is like, it's really hard to tell when that's actually happening, but luckily, if the behavior is consistent, it doesn't matter because you can still tell the relationship of those vessels. And because what I was talking about, the recency of encounters, stuff that happened maybe 2 years ago might not be as relevant. So when it was, for example, in a different vessel, so it will always be biased towards the most recent thing. So yeah, that's probably the answer. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Fernando. There's another one here, which is, can Starboard use radar band or steel reflectors to detect dark targets? So I think that talks to our use of satellite data for detecting dark vessels. And we don't currently use terrestrial forms of radar, although we could ingest that data, but we do satellite surveillance using synthetic aperture radar, radio frequency and optical imagery to detect vessels. I think that's a subject of another webinar though, because there's quite a lot of detail to go into how that's done. Just looking at the list, and it's great that we've got so many questions, so thank you for that, keep them coming. So far, the data display goes back from 2020 to 2022. Is there data that goes back before 2020? So I would just be interested to understand why that's important to you, if you feel like explaining that or expanding on that. But currently the AIS data that we have goes back to May 2020, and we do actually have back to May 2019, but we haven't processed it into Starboard as yet. That takes a lot of computing power and processing time, and we've been wanting to improve some of the foundational data in the platform before we actually take that step. But if that's something that is definitely of interest, we'd be keen to hear from you on that.
Maybe something to add specific to the networks is that we do include data that it goes far back in the past, but because of what we're trying to do is trying to highlight the current risk or potential risk of a vessel. We, and remember again, the recency. So for example, an encounter that happened yesterday is about twice as relevant as an encounter that happened half a year ago, or about 4 times as relevant as one that happened a year ago. The rationale for this is that, at least in the context of IUU fishing, you want to be aware of, basically you want to have that vessel come to your attention shortly after has caught some fish and potentially done some transshipment, which is when you can do something about it. If you include encounters from a long time ago, perhaps it's useful for knowing the general profile of that vessel, but less useful for currently action that you can take. Of course, that depends on the problem. That's true for IUU vessel, but if you were thinking about, I don't know, human trafficking or drug trafficking or problems like that, perhaps it will change. It will change. Maybe you can do prosecutions that go further back in the past and things like that. So it's something that is more or less relevant depending on the problem or the question or the type of vessels of interest for you.
Great. We've got another question, which is, what are the parameters used in detecting an encounter? So could you just talk to that?
Yes, I don't have the exact numbers on the top of my head, but I believe it's something like we count an encounter if we observe 2 vessels at, I think it's less than 200 meters from each other for at least 30 minutes or 15 minutes while they are moving at 2 knots or less, or that's something like that. So, but basically, of course, that plays a little bit of role, but we're fairly sensitive to them, as in like, we should be catching most of the encounters unless they're really, really fast, or if the precision of the AIS transmissions is really bad, so then they don't appear really close to each other.
Thanks. There was a comment about us being very similar to, I think, the platform that IHS Markit provides, but in a simpler form. I think it's worth mentioning that we are actually in discussion with S&P, who owns IHS Markit data, to integrate their data into Starboard, which would give you the same visibility of all the vessel information in one platform. So let's keep our fingers crossed that that progresses. And there was a question about, can we extract the data from the system if we detected an encountered vessel that will provide evidence for prosecution? So yes, you can extract the data that is relevant to the encounter with the location, the duration, the vessels involved, etc. I couldn't tell you for sure whether that is classed as evidential data, and I guess that will be tried in court. But I think it could be used as the basis for providing the information on where these vessels were at a given point in time. So hopefully that answers your question there. I think that's all the questions that we've had so far. Unless anybody else has any additional questions, we've still got a good 5 or 10 minutes to go before the next webinar is due to start. So feel free to add your questions in. If you're not current users and you want to learn more about these features, or actually if you are current users and you want to learn more about these features, by all means, get in touch. And if I just switch back to the presentation, if you don't already have our contact details, they're here. So feel free to get in touch. Would be happy to run through additional demonstrations, or to talk about your use cases and see if there are things that are coming through the roadmap that may be able to answer more of your questions than you are dealing with at the moment. Fernando, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, that's it. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening.